drags on. The smoke is in your eyes. You know the blame is someone's, but you don't quite know who. If it could only be different, if only you could run away from this. If you could only
who is man? What's man's place in the universe? Where are we going? Where do we find meaning? What is our purpose? And I think the best sense that we get of this purpose, of this meaning, comes from the Bible, from Orthodox Christianity. So I'm just going to talk about the basics here, not anything too wild. If we think about two contrasting worldviews, the worldview where there's no meaning, the universe is chaotic, there's just a random smashing of molecules and atoms together that doesn't have any direction or any purpose, that kind of a universe is ultimately, in philosophical terminology, nihilistic, meaning that it's purposeless, it has no intention, it's just chaos. And so in that kind of a universe, people who are tempted with that attitude, they see, things like death and destruction, and they want to sort of capitulate to the idea that man has no meaning and no purpose. And so nihilism really, I think, is the first step towards despair, towards thinking that there's no right and wrong, there's no good and evil. But if we reorient ourselves and open ourselves up to the possibility that there is a God, that there is meaning, that there is purpose, and that there are principles exterior to man that man doesn't create or cause to be. Now, man has a role in the universe. He's a kind of a priest, we would say, underneath God, where he can do certain things in the world, but he doesn't ultimately make meaning. He finds meaning in God's meaning, in something outside of himself, something more than himself. And that's really the only way that we can find meaning and purpose and morals, is by looking beyond just our own inner worship, our own inner selves, which we're always tempted to do. So if we go back to the Garden of Eden, that kind of archetypal story that we have in Genesis, as we were just talking with Alex, the temptation in part there on the part of the serpent, as we said, and I don't think it's a snake, it's a kind of an angelic being presented in the form of a serpent, or something like a fallen angel that appears in that form. And so it's not a literal snake. And that temptation is that man could become God or like God in his own way, in his own shortcut way, by bypassing the things that God had already created, which were good. So in other words, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't in itself evil. The tree of life was also there in the garden. And in our view, man needed to sort of train himself in virtue. He needed to pass a test of virtue before he was ready to partake of both trees. So we actually think that there's nothing inherently evil about the other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but that you needed to be grounded in virtue first before you had that knowledge. Satan tempted man with bypassing the attaining of virtue and going straight for a kind of gnosis, a kind of direct, intuitive, I don't need God, I'll do it my own way. And that's actually the temptation that he gives, is you will be like God. You will determine good and evil. You will determine true and false on your own. You'll be your own kind of little God without God. And that's because, in our views, there had already been a fall amongst the angelic beings. So Satan had already given into that temptation, as well as the angels that fell with him. And so he's now tempting man with the same temptation that he gave into. And so he wanted to be like God. We read about this in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, where there's this desire to be like Jehovah, like the Lord. And he wanted then to destroy man, because in our view, there was always going to be the theophanic manifestation of God in human nature, that man was always going to, that Christ was always going to take on human nature, even if there had not been a fall. So this is what enraged in part the angels that fell with Satan, that became demons. And so ever since then, they've kind of set up this worship in defiance of the true God, by making themselves the angelic rulers or the gods of the nations. So the demons that duped mankind throughout the world, in the ancient world, to sort of promote what we would say is universal idolatry. This is what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, that all of the world really fell into this demonic delusion, except for a remnant throughout history, so except for a group of people. So it began in the Garden of Eden with, in our view, God does save Adam and Eve even after they fell, but they're still going to have to go through the gateway of death before an eventual resurrection. So even though there is still salvation for Adam and Eve, they still had to experience physical death, and they couldn't immediately go back to to paradise or Eden or the presence of God. So all throughout history, you have this this manifestation of the nations, the world empires, whether it's Egypt or Babylon or whoever. They're really under subservience to this fallen entity that's constantly trying to erect a spiritual kingdom, a world power. And it's not, when I say spiritual, I don't mean anti-physical or anti-historical. It's a spiritual reality that manifests in history. And so these entities, these powers, they really promote, for example, things like human sacrifice in a lot of these cultures. And as we go through the Old Testament, we read about the Israelites being constantly tempted with that same type of human sacrifice, almost, you could say, sex rights that pop up all the time. And it's not that sex is bad, but it has a purpose. And so in the demonic plan, the intention is to always subvert that, because it's one of the easiest ways to subvert humanity through sort of our fundamental desires, you know, what Maslow eventually calls, right, our hierarchy of needs. And the demonic idea is that man could be controlled through these passions. And by passions, I don't mean like passionate love when your aunt is reading her Harlequin romance novels. I'm talking about the desires that we have, desires of the body, desires of the heart. Any kind of desires really can be co-opted to where we become addicted to or attached to certain vices. And so part of the purpose of the law is to help curb the vices. But what we find is that that's not enough. Man needs more than just rules and lists of things that help him to curb vices. You know, we have the 10 Commandments, sure. And man has free will, but what is unique to Christianity is this notion of grace, that we also need a kind of divine power that enables us to fulfill those commands and to be healed from the things that occurred when we all fell in Adam, so to speak. So we all experience the effects of Adam's fall, which is death and the passions that we are tempted with, or in the West, this is sometimes called concupiscence. It's the same idea. So we need to be healed from that. But in the biblical narrative, even in the Old Testament, there's always a demonic connection to this notion of the passions and the desires. And I'm not saying that everybody who sins, we all sin, but there's something inherently demonic about sin. It's always a turning towards ourselves, a worshiping of ourselves and our own desires, and not keeping with God's law or the 10 Commandments, so forth and so on. So what's the purpose there? Well, if you look at things like the extremes, when Israel falls into really extreme temptations and failures, like in the book of Numbers, we read about the temptation at Baal Peor, which means Lord of open holes. And I don't mean to be gross and graphic, but this is akin to something like ancient sex rites. And this involved everything you could think of, everything degraded and perverse. And so this is a very memorable event in the history of Israel, where they're tempted with this, and it has to be curbed immediately, or else you would have kind of had the destruction of Israel, which their purpose is to bring about the Messiah. So that there's always this falling away throughout the Old Testament, and then you have the prophets come and they preach, and then there's a restoration to some form of purity in the worship of God under King Josiah, for example. There's many examples of this throughout. David, of course, was a righteous king. And then Israel would fall back into that temptation to worship ultimately what amounts to demonic powers. So we read about this like in the book of Ezekiel or in the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah talks about the temptation that the Israelites had to want to sacrifice their children. So what we're realizing is that when we see things like the temptations,
I'm going to put you on something crazy real quick. Most of these Zoomer gym bros are consuming macro-guzzling synthetic dyes and synthetic sweeteners on the daily. They don't even know it. Goofy AF. There's nothing great about that. Do not listen any further or invade a small village. Chad Mode stands out from the crowd by excluding artificial flavors, preservatives, sweeteners, and dyes. We've even
to subvert the natural, the pure, and what is the case, and turn it into something aberrant. And aberrations and perversions, they always kind of fade away eventually, right? Because they don't have the ability to cause life or cause creativity. They always end up kind of ending themselves. And that's the good news when it comes to evil. And we were talking about these examples in the Old Testament where Israel was tempted with, the perversion at Baal Peor. Israel was tempted with sacrificing their children in the book of Jeremiah. And then we have these prophecies, these promises of a coming Savior all throughout the Old Testament, all these texts, all the way up to the minor prophets, predicting that there will be one that comes out of Bethlehem of Judea, that is of the lineage of David, that is he's the culmination of the covenant. He is the fulfillment of the temple and the animal sacrifices and all those things that pointed to him, the Passover. He's the Pascha, we would say, in the Orthodox Church. So who is this person? Well, we would say it's the second person of the Godhead, the eternal Son of the Father, Jesus Christ, who in John 1, for example, is said to be with God. He is God. He's the eternal creator through whom all things came to be. So the Father has an eternal Son. He's that angel of the Lord that we see all the way throughout the Old Testament. If you've read the Bible, if you read the Torah and the Psalms and the prophets, you know that there's this messenger of the covenant, this angel messenger that constantly appears. The word angel, of course, can mean different things. It can mean just a messenger. It could be a human messenger, or it could be a divine messenger. And we would say that this is that chariot rider that we read about in Ezekiel 1 through 10. This is that being that appears in the fiery furnace with Daniel and his companions. This is the angel of the Lord that appears and speaks to Samson's parents in the book of Judges, that appears to even Hagar in the early chapters of Genesis, who appears to Abraham, who's also the one walking with Adam and Eve. And one way we know that that's who that is, if you believe the New Testament, is that Jesus has a dialogue with the Pharisees in John 5 through 9, and he says that no one sees the Father at any time. And so the Pharisees are kind of, oh yeah, that's true. You can't see God, the Father, so to speak. So who was speaking with and talking to Jesus on the mountain, or excuse me, with Moses on Mount Sinai? Who was it that appeared and had a meal with Abraham? Who was it that was making all these appearances, this voice of the Lord, this form of God's glory, according to Ezekiel, that keeps appearing and manifesting, who's given the name and the title Yahweh? And in many of those passages, by the way, it also speaks of God's Spirit being upon the coming upon the judges, and God's Spirit being given by the laying on of hands of Moses to the Israelites. So in other words, God the Father, Yahweh, his Son, in whom is his name, if you read Exodus 3 and 23, is this angel. That's Jesus. That's the second person that manifested throughout all of these Old Testament texts, who was kind of there all along, leading and guiding the nation of Israel, and then manifests in the New Testament as the fulfillment of all those promises, not just to be an earthly ruler or king, but to actually save humanity from himself and from his worship of the fallen angelic entities, the demons, the gods of the nations, which David says in the Psalms, the gods of the nations are devils, right? The Song of Moses says that the nations worship the devils, we worship the true God. But there was all these prophecies throughout all of the texts of the Psalms, Isaiah many, many times over, about how there would be an eventual point where the covenant would be opened up to the Gentiles. The Gentiles would be invited in to join in the same covenantal relationship that the Jews had to worship the one true God. And for us, that is exactly what we have in the establishment of the church in the book of Acts, in Acts 2, and in the person of Christ when he became incarnate. So that church opens up this pathway, this covenant, this relationship beyond just, manipulation of matter or something like that. A lot of pagan religion, for example, has the idea that you can get God to do what you want if you offer up, enough sacrifices, or if you do this or that. And this is really an erroneous pagan idea. It's another way of subverting what God's will is, for us imposing our own will and saying, I want it this way. I'm going to make the gods do what I want. I'm going to make Zeus do what I want by doing this or that. You can't really get God to do those things, right? God, you have your will aligned with God. And that's called synergy in our view. So you synergize your will with the divine will, which is, of course, things like the Ten Commandments. And we would say Jesus, when he came and he taught, he didn't teach anything different than the Ten Commandments. We would say he's the one that gave the Ten Commandments. Because as he says in John 5-9, he was the one at Mount Sinai talking to Moses. He was the one giving the law. And this really enrages the Pharisees. And we would say that this is, a very controversial doctrine, the doctrine of the Trinity. But it's actually an Old Testament teaching. It's actually a doctrine in the Torah and in the prophets and in the Psalms. So it's not anything foreign to the Bible, which Muslims often think, for example, or Jehovah's Witnesses, these kinds of groups. It's actually something that comes from the Bible. But all of these prophecies are leading up to this kingdom that Christ would establish. We would say, I believe that's the Orthodox Church. So how would we know this, though? What are the things that point to this being the case, this being the reality that is out there, that's what reality is really about, is this spiritual stuff that I'm talking about? I would say that if you think about the impossibility, for example, of the atheist or the materialist worldview, by materialism, I don't mean the accumulation of material objects, but the idea that only matter exists, right? A lot of the atheists, a lot of the Dawkinses, the Daniel Dennets, the Hitchens, these kind of atheists, Sam Harris, these kinds of philosophers and thinkers, they believe that all that exists is just pure, random, chaotic matter. If that's the case, then that leads to certain conclusions about reality. For example, we don't actually have free will. We don't actually make choices. And many of those philosophers are actually pretty consistent with that. If you think about, for example, Sam Harris says, yeah, there is no free will, and that we think we're learning things is an illusion. We're not really learning truths and discovering things. We think we are, but we're just really a determined chemical process doing that. And we're under the delusion that we've made these discoveries and choices. Of course, if he was to really apply that to his own life, then he wouldn't be able to say that he wrote his books. He's not actually arguing for anything that he discovered because there aren't really any discoveries. There's no true versus false. There's only determined chemical process. So in other words, this is called the determinist fallacy or the naturalist fallacy. This would undermine the possibility of having knowledge at all if the materialist worldview were the case. You also couldn't get morals from this worldview. There was a famous atheist philosopher named David Hume in the Enlightenment, and he raised this question. It's called the is-ought dilemma. And he pointed out that, hey, we atheists, we got to be more consistent. We're calling out these religious believers, but look, we don't have a basis for right and wrong. The fact that reality is just matter in motion, it doesn't tell you that it should be some other way. And since there's nothing about molecules themselves that tell you that they ought to be in some other configuration, if all that exists is molecules in motion, there's no basis for saying that they ought to be some other way. Therefore, you can't derive an ought, a moral obligation, something right or something wrong, from what is the case, from just a bunch of molecules. And so if you try to do that as an atheist materialist, you will always end up in a position that is arbitrary, that is purely subjective, and has no real basis in actual reality or in fact. You can't justify or give an account for why it would be wrong to do anything, to murder, to rape, to steal, to whatever. And so these are some examples of what philosophy does, where it says, let's analyze these positions and see if it actually makes any sense to believe that all of reality is pure matter. This is the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer, from Jay's Analysis. We are talking about spirituality and philosophy. When we come back, we'll get even deeper. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We're talking about spirituality. We're talking about dimensions. We're talking about portals and the realm that exists all around us, that next dimension up, so to speak. I think there's dimensions below us too, darker dimensions. And the choices that we make in life, we can kind of tap into those various dimensions. We were just talking about the limitations, for example, of the materialist atheist worldview, how they really box themselves into positions that can't make sense of morals. There's not really a basis to say something's right and wrong. I understand that most atheists would say they believe this or that is right or wrong, but there's not really a basis that's consistent to do that if all that exists is just pure matter in motion. And so these are kind of indicators These are flaws in the philosophy of atheism that we can identify that help us to figure out, well, this doesn't really seem to be like a workable worldview. This doesn't make a lot of sense. And it doesn't seem to give it much of an account of reality. I mean, life seems to have meaning. Life seems to have purpose. Trees, plants, things kind of grow from seeds into a full-blown thing. There seems to be kind of a purpose there, not random chaos. And so there is design, there is telos or purpose in the world, there is intentionality. And if there's an intentionality at a small level, if we have meaning at a small human level, it stands to reason that there's probably meaning at a grand level, at a universal level. And I don't think it's a leap to think that. In fact, it's a necessary thing to have meaning and purpose for knowledge at all. And so this is what's sometimes called a transcendental argument for God, this idea that the transcendent is necessary to undergird the world that we know, to have morals in this world, to have knowledge in this world. It requires kind of basics that are more than just matter. Things like numbers, things like laws of logic, things like language, those are not physical things. You can't look under a microscope and find a law of logic. Yet every sentence that a human being makes, every word they speak, requires in.
I want to show off something that we're all proud of. I got a browser here. This is Jay Dyer's much vaunted, much sought after Philosophy 101. Now, he just got this page up. We are just testing it out. You guys are some of the first people in the world to see it. I want to say, for my part, it's not Philosophy 101. I think this is a mistitling. I really think of it as like Philosophy Unleashed, because a Philosophy 101 course, they give you kind of some use dozens, the origin abundance of, I think, out in philosophy. Here is one of the over those.
It's some kind of logos, so some kind of meaning, some kind of principle that's more than just molecules, that gives this or that collection of molecules meaning, gives it structure, gives it order. Now, not everything in reality or life is necessarily structured and ordered. Some things are kind of chaotic, at least from the human vantage point. But that doesn't mean in the divine mind or in the divine vantage point, ultimately everything isn't ordered and structured. So even evil things can have a long-term, big-scale purpose, even if we in our finite human minds don't understand them. This is sort of the point of the book of Job, right? Job is struggling with the existence of evil, the problem of evil. Many atheists, many unbelievers, they have a problem with this. And they should read the book of Job, because the book of Job is really addressing that struggle, which we all have at some point, and in some degree. Even if you believe, we oftentimes wonder, why is this happening? And one of the answers that's given towards the end of the book is that man can't ultimately understand all of the infinite variations of creation, all of the different timelines and potentialities that get chosen. And so how could man understand the big picture, being that he can't even understand minute things? So in other words, it's almost like an impossible question, and there's no worldview that can answer that question. So it's not even really a legitimate, I mean, it's saying you can ask the question, but the question is almost kind of an unanswerable question, so to speak. Like, how do we know that this or that event won't bring about some greater good down the road? So the problem of evil is really a pseudo problem, because to say that there's evil requires some notion of the good. You couldn't say that the Christian God is evil or that Christianity is bad if you didn't have some criteria, some structure by which you're saying or judging things, a value judgment, we call it. If you didn't have a standard to make value judgments, you couldn't say anything was good or bad. So the question then gets flipped. Well, what's the basis for good and bad? What's the basis for saying the true versus the false, the good versus the evil? You see, those are automatically philosophical concepts. So we're going to have a worldview that makes sense of true and false, good and evil. And I would argue that ultimately only the Christian perspective really makes sense of those things. That's not to say that Muslims or whoever, that they don't believe in good and evil. But I'm saying that in the final analysis, the best perspective, the most philosophically coherent perspective is, I think, the Christian perspective. Because we have not just an account for good and evil, but also things like logic, the true versus the false, the good versus the bad. We have an ability and a basis to make judgment calls, to say why it's wrong to murder, why it's wrong to do these things, right? I mean, take for example the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are a pretty good structure to have for a functioning society. So even if you didn't believe in God, I mean, it seems like that's a pretty good basic moral code to have for society, and that kind of suggests that maybe this moral code does come from some kind of living God or some kind of being that we can have a relationship with. But I think there's a great insight here in regard to this principle of logos, right? Which, if you go back to the ancient philosophers, or even in the book of Proverbs, there's this idea of wisdom, and wisdom personified, particularly as you get up into like Proverbs 7 and 8, right? Wisdom is personified as a woman. Wisdom is personified as having structured the universe. That's why we find patterns in nature. There's a book that Orthodox and Catholics accept that has a statement about how everything in the created order is made via number. And that deuterocanonical text is describing that everything really is has this principle of numeric pattern and geometry in it, which bears the stamp of an intentional creator. And so we see this, for example, in the Fibonacci sequence in nature. We see it in things like Mandelbrot sets, which appear in nature, in the natural world. These are really high mathematical concepts, which we know if you look into Mandelbrot sets. For example, there's a great lecture that a physicist named Dr. Jason Lisle did on Mandelbrot sets. Those can't be human inventions. For a long time, people might have thought, well, mathematics, that's something that humans made up. It's a social convention. It's a social construct that we use. No, actually, as many mathematicians have pointed out, these are discoveries. And if they're a discovery, they're not something that's a human creation. Humans can create symbols that represent those mathematical principles, but the mathematical principles themselves are discovered and not caused or created by a finite human mind. And the best example of this is Mandelbrot sets, which we couldn't even see or know in terms of the specification of magnetism until computers were invented to actually demonstrate this. So we had to get to a certain point in the processing power of computers to be able to zoom in infinite depth, so to speak. I mean, in a limited sense of infinite depth, to see the repeating structures and patterns in Mandelbrot sets. And what this shows us is that this mathematical principle was something discovered, not invented by human beings. And it's also a principle that's not just found in, set theory and in computers, but actually in the world. The natural structure of, for example, forests, of coastlines and so forth, they actually display the principles of Mandelbrot sets. So these are discoveries that are made, very high-level mathematic discoveries. Well, what is the point of all this? What does this actually tell us? Well, if you go watch Dr. Jason Lisle's presentations on Mandelbrot sets on YouTube, you'll notice that this shows us that there's actually mathematical principles that underlie all of nature and reality. Therefore, purpose, meaning, structure, geometry, even things that Plato in the Timaeus talked about, Socrates talked about, this geometric structure that we find at a fundamental level in nature, it's not because of the human mind causing it to be there. It's not a social construct, it's a discovery. And that tells us that reality itself is structured. It does have a mathematical structure, and it has telos, and it has purpose. And that's just one of the elements that I'm getting at with this idea of logos that we find in John 1. And John 1 is referencing the text, the wisdom text that we find in Proverbs, like Proverbs 7, Proverbs 8, and other places in the deuterocanonical text, where everything is created via number and structure. That tells us there's a divine mind, that the divine mind is the ground of all of reality that we see. And thus, the world is created. So we should get to know the creator. So I want to remind you guys too that we will be in Las Vegas, June 22nd. It's going to be a great 6-hour presentation.
a straw man.
Second, yes, I'm analyzing my own failure. From it, you can see why it took me so long to leave Christianity, because I can be taken in by arguments and fail to see the problems with them at first glance. As a believer, first glance is all I would give them. Now I give them far more scrutiny.
Let's put that to the test. Now, some of you may know, I recently had an informal debate with Godless Granny on the topic, are there any good reasons to believe God exists? And even more recently, she came out with a review of our discussion, calling it Eric's Faulty Brain, where she goes through and analyzes the debate. And as you just heard, allegedly analyzes some of her own failures and then corrects them, pointing out where she thinks my argument failed or even completely came apart, according to her.
What is wrong with that God for giving Eric such a faulty brain?
And no, I didn't mess with the audio. That was all her. But I wonder.
What is wrong with that God for giving Eric such a faulty brain?
Wow.
Now, after watching this, it seems that I can only come to one of two conclusions. And I want to tell you these conclusions up front before we go through her analysis of our discussion. Either one, she didn't understand the argument and still doesn't, but doubles down in her confidence despite this. Or two, she totally understands the argument and is purposely misrepresenting me or perhaps lying. Now, I'm not one to psychoanalyze, but again, this seems to be the only two conclusions that I can come up with, and let's see what you think as we go through this. Now, to be quite honest with you, this was not a video that I wanted to make, but I figured there were enough mistakes in here that I could actually use this as a teaching opportunity and unpack the argument a little bit further, explain a little bit of some basics in philosophy, and just overall do a review for you guys. I think the first thing to do would be to properly understand the argument. And I was using my version or variation of Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. And rather than going through it and rehashing the argument myself, you can, of course, go back and look at the video. Allow me to show you the argument with slides in a debate I had with Justin Schieber on whether or not God exists. Now, the reason I want to show you the argument this way is because, again, as I just mentioned, there are slides involved, and I don't have to make slides all over again. Sue me. And also because in my discussion with Granny, she would interrupt quite a bit, which I didn't mind. Actually, I invited it because it can be a bit of a technical argument. I'll put it this way, and feel free to jump in at any point. And thank you for jumping in. I want to be clear, from the outset. That way, we don't talk past each other. Nevertheless, in my opening debate with Justin, clearly I just had those few minutes to lay out the argument uninterrupted. Granted, I was debating Justin, but same argument. So when I say the name Justin, I'll just replace it with the name Granny, and same thing applies. Now, just as I did with Granny, what you'll see me first do is lay a foundation for the argument that I'm going to give. Either theism is true and God exists, or atheism is true and God does not exist. Now, by simple rules of logic, if you can eliminate one of these options, then the other one must be true. Now, given that I was debating Godless Granny, same thing, either theism or atheism. So here's the beginning where I lay the foundation and then the argument.
Given that this debate is between
Granny and me,
there are only two live options on the table for answering tonight's question: atheism and theism. If we define atheism as a position that God does not exist, and theism as a position that God does exist, then by eliminating one of these options, we are ultimately left with the only option that will answer tonight's question.
so there either is a God or is not a God. And I would say that if we could define atheism as the belief God does not exist, either that's true or theism is true, the belief God does exist. So as you can see, same thing with Godless Granny. Now, here's the argument, which in my debate with Justin, I called it the argument from knowledge and rationality.
Premise 1. If atheism is true, then knowledge and rationality would not exist. 2. Some atheists,
Such as Granny,
have used their knowledge and rationality to become atheists. Therefore, knowledge and rationality exist, and therefore, atheism is false. This would mean that to even answer tonight's question, God must exist. By way of preliminary remarks, knowledge is at minimum a justified or warranted true belief. Think of this like ingredients in a cake. If you're missing one ingredient, you can't have knowledge. To illustrate, suppose you wake up from a nap and you see that the microwave reads 12 o'clock. And on that basis, you form the belief that it is 12 o'clock. But then you feel that it's hot in your house, there's water under the fridge, and you notice that the microwave is actually blinking 12 o'clock. And thus, you conclude that the power must have gone out. Now, the question is it 12 o'clock? Well, you don't know. As they say, a broken clock is still right twice a day. But the point here is that if your belief that it is 12 o'clock is based solely on the reading of the microwave, and given that the power has gone out, then you now have what's called an undercutting defeater for trusting in the reliability of the microwave, and this would equally remove all rational justification for trusting in the validity and truth of any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave. In the same way, if there is no God, then a similar problem arises on atheism, with which have to do with the reliability of our cognitive faculties, and for the sake of simplicity, we can just say the brain. First, if there is no God, then our brains were not designed to obtain truth. This is no designer. And second, if there is no God, then our cognitive faculties, given natural selection, value and not truth value. In other words, if our beliefs and behaviors play any role in this evolutionary process, the natural selection is going to select for beliefs that produce adaptive behavior and grant survival value. Consequently, this would mean that natural selection wouldn't care whether or not your beliefs are true, but merely that your beliefs help you to adapt and survive.
Now, in my debate with Justin, I go on to give an example, but I didn't Godless Granny because up to this point she had actually already agreed. All that being said, now you get to the fact that you can have false beliefs producing adaptive behavior and survival value. So my beliefs don't have to be true. Okay.
Correct.
So as you can tell, she has conceded everything in my argument thus far. Now keep in mind that I'm showing you my argument for my debate with Justin because that only took me about 3 minutes, wherein my discussion with Godless Granny took about 10 plus minutes. Nevertheless, given that she's agreed on everything thus far, let's now see how it applies to everything I've argued.
Now I say that to say, just as there is an undercutting defeater for trusting in the reliability of the microwave, which would further remove all rational justification for the validity and truth of any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave, then in the same way, if there is no God, then you now have an undercutting defeater for trusting in the rational reliability of your brain, which further removes all rational justification for trusting in the validity and truth of any belief your brain produces. And thus, if atheism is true,
and Granny's brain has produced in her
the belief that there is no God, then it becomes a belief that is undercut by this type of defeater, and thus he shouldn't trust or believe it. Moreover, if knowledge is at minimum a justified true belief, and if given naturalism, you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces, then rational justification for trusting in the truth of your beliefs becomes unjustified, and without these ingredients, knowledge becomes impossible. Hence, my argument that if
atheists like Granny
have used their knowledge and rationality to become atheist, then knowledge and rationality exist, and therefore atheism is false. And once again, if atheism is false, then theism is true, and God does exist.
So with the foundation laid and the argument understood, let's now look at Godless Granny's video, which again she titled Eric's Faulty Brain.
What is wrong with that God for giving Eric such a faulty brain?
And I think we can title this video Granny's Faulty Thinking. Recall what she said in the opening of her video.
From it, you can see why it took me so long to leave Christianity, because I can be taken in by arguments and fail to see the problems with them at first glance. As a believer, first glance is all I would give them. Now I give them far more scrutiny.
And this is what I want to put to the test. She's claimed that she was a Christian because she could be taken in by bad arguments, but now, as a non-believer, she now gives arguments far more scrutiny. But does she? And does she apply this scrutiny to her own arguments? Recall the two conclusions I mentioned earlier that I came to after watching this video. Either she didn't understand the argument and still doesn't, but doubles down her confidence despite this, or two, she totally understands the argument and is purposely misrepresenting me or lying. So, let's take a look at Granny's faulty thinking. Now this video was a bit hard to make because there are a lot of categories of errors in the way that she was thinking, or what I would call her faulty thinking. And because there are so many areas to pick and choose from, and honestly one of the reasons I didn't want to make this video. In fact, I feel like it was like a big ball of tangled stuff that I have to untangle just to explain before I can even respond to them. Nevertheless, what I ended up doing was separating these faulty ways of thinking, or these problematic ways of thinking, into certain categories. And we're going to go through each one as they come up.
He had an argument that took me by surprise. In the moment, I could not see through it. I could only see that it couldn't possibly be right.
Now, this brings me to the first problem with her faulty thinking, and that's her carelessness with the words that she uses. what astounds me is the confidence she has and in the way she uses these words. She said my argument couldn't possibly be right. Now, when we're talking logic and philosophy, which is what this whole discussion is, saying that something is not possibly true or correct is to say essentially that it is impossible. Some things are either possible or impossible, possibly true or not possibly true. Now, if you can give reasons for something, that at least grants that it is possibly true. There is a possible reason to believe it. Granted, having reasons to believe something doesn't make it true, but again, having reasons at least makes it possibly true. So, note how she almost immediately contradicts herself by agreeing with me. So that there could be reasons and evidence for something doesn't make something true.
But the fact that both have reasons mean that reasons to believe something don't make it true. We agree on this point.
And if we agree that there are at least reasons to believe something, even if it doesn't make it true, well, then I guess it's at least possibly true. Now, 2 more categories are going to come up. The first is her attempt to psychoanalyze me. Now, I usually try to avoid trying to psychoanalyze someone because what I often find is typically when people begin to psychoanalyze, it's because they don't have any good responses or good rebuttals or arguments or objections to what the person's saying, and oftentimes they're just trying to be nitpicky or just find things to argue about, which brings me to the other point. The other category that we're about to bring up, which could easily fall under the careless category, but we're going to make it a new category and call it being overly pedantic. That is to say, there were times where she'd be argumentative about things that didn't need to be argued or defensive about things that she didn't need to be defensive about. Here are examples in one clip. I'll put it this way, and feel free to jump in at any point.
I didn't say anything, but I found this to be rather arrogant of Eric. This is my show. I don't need his permission to make comments on my show.
Well, you recall that I said earlier, I understand it's a bit of a technical argument, so I didn't mind being interrupted or having someone jump in if they didn't understand something or wanted me to clarify something. So this isn't me being arrogant, this is me inviting discussion and saying up front that I'm not trying to make this a monologue.
I don't need his permission to make comments on my show. Although, to be fair, I realized what he meant to say was that he didn't mind being interrupted.
Oh, so you realize that's actually what I meant, and you even clarify that in this video. So why bring it up? And if you realize this, then why not just go with the charitable interpretation instead of being uncharitable and nitpicky and overly pedantic?
However, he could have phrased that in a manner that didn't come across as him thinking that this is his show.
Now recall the foundation that I laid in order to get to the argument, namely that there are 2 exhaustive options. Either God does exist, theism is true, or God does not exist, and atheism is true. Here's what she said in her commentary review.
There is another possibility, and that is that gods exist. It could be phrased either no gods exist, or a god or gods exist. Here's the first sign of Eric's smuggling in presuppositionalism. He's created the false dichotomy of either there is no God or there is a God.
Now, in just those few seconds, we hit a few categories. So let's begin with the careless thinking. And here's why I say that. Off the air, Kelly had mentioned that she bought my book, which I'm very appreciative of. And then in discussion, she says,
I'm familiar with enough of what was in Eric's book. I read what was in Eric's book. It's actually a pretty good argument.
Now, I'm not necessarily assuming that she read the whole book, but she did buy the Kindle version. And I say that because she could have easily looked this up. In just the 3rd chapter on page 38, I actually provide the very definition and phrasing that she's looking for of theism and atheism. Theism, the belief that a god or gods exist. Atheism, the belief that a god or gods does not exist. So, given that using her Kindle to do a simple word search would have been
super easy, barely an inconvenience,
we can chalk this up to careless thinking. But even if we set that aside, in our discussion, she actually agreed with me. We went back and forth on this for a little bit, but note the agreement. Either God does exist or does not exist, right? That seems to be exhaustive. Note the head nod in agreement. So we can say it is either true that the statement God does not exist is true, or the statement that God does exist is true. So we could classify the first one as, go ahead.
I would say that you could also have the statement, I don't know whether God exists or not.
Right, but that wouldn't be an answer to whether or not God does exist. In other words, the question of God's
It would
existence.
not be an answer to whether or not God exists, but it would answer the question of, do I have enough information to know whether or not God exists?
Right, and so that's more of an epistemic question where I'm talking ontological. So, in other words, is there gold on Mars? Yes or no? Well, the answer is yes or no, right? There, it's either there is or there isn't. So there either is a God or is not a God. And yet, despite all that, she says,
Here's the first sign of Eric smuggling in presuppositionalism. He's created the false dichotomy of either there is no God or there is a God. Had I brought this up, this would not have changed the argument, however.
Right. So, overly pedantic?
I do have to wonder how Eric classifies polytheism.
Actually, you don't. Remember, I just a few seconds earlier, because you have the, you could search Kindle with the.
By his dichotomy, polytheism is atheism.
No.
Eric defines theism as the belief that a God exists. Since polytheism rejects this premise, it is not theism, as Eric has defined theism.
Well, right, because I'm talking to an atheist and I'm not a polytheist, so I figured we could simplify the discussion and just define it in these ways, as I did with Justin and as I even did with you when we had this discussion. I said if we can define it this way. Nevertheless, her point is that because I define theism as a belief that a God exists, she says then by default, polytheism would have to be atheism. But no, because here's, again, the careless thinking. Even if we grant what she's saying, given the definition she just reiterated that I mentioned in our discussion, polytheism would not be atheism, but she's claiming here it is.
By his dichotomy, polytheism is atheism.
But then immediately says,
but it also doesn't fit Eric's definition of atheism, the belief that no gods exist.
I can't make this up.
Where did the polytheists go, Eric?
They're theists. But remember, I'm talking to an atheist. I'm not a polytheist.
But again, this is not a defeater of the argument. It's just a side note.
So next she comments on how we begin to argue about something that, again, I don't think needed to be argued about. Essentially, I said that if there is no God, then the best explanation for our existence would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection. And commenting on this, she said,
I caught a false dichotomy.
No. Given that you're an atheist and I am a theist, these seem to be the two best live options.
At this point, I had no idea where Eric's argument was headed.
Then how would you know if it's a false dichotomy?
I didn't want to agree to a false dichotomy if it became an important part of the argument later.
Or you can just be honest and state what you agree with and be able to defend it. Rather than try to see where I'm going, just agree with the views that you agree with and disagree with the views that you disagree with. So far, I'm just saying, given the best evidence we have, if there were no God, based on the evidence we have today, the best explanation would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection.
You can see me trying to figure out two things simultaneously. First, is Eric's statement true? Just because we exist via evolution doesn't mean that's the only possible way for intelligent life to come to be.
So we just hit a new category. You thought I forgot about those, didn't you? I kind of wish I did, to be honest with you. So this category is going to be straw man. Now, what is that? A straw man is a logical fallacy, which, by the way, you can also find in my book. We've got a whole chapter on just how to identify logical fallacies. And a straw man logical fallacy is when you misrepresent a person's position or argument. Now, this can be done intentionally or unintentionally, but it's essentially when you misrepresent a person's argument, we call this a straw man, and then destroy this straw man argument and then claim victory as if you have actually destroyed the person's argument. So to illustrate, suppose you put my face on a scarecrow, knock the scarecrow over, beat it up, and then claim victory that you have beat quote-unquote Eric Hernandez. Well, no, you have only be a straw man of Eric Hernandez. In the same way, when you take a person's argument, like mine, and misrepresent it and then quote-unquote destroy that argument, you have not destroyed my argument or exposed my faulty brain. You have only destroyed and presented a straw man of my argument, which was never my argument to begin with. So with this in mind, let's re-listen to the summation of what I said and her commentary on what I said. So far, I'm just saying, given the best evidence we have, if there were no God, based on the evidence we have today, the best explanation would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection. And how does she rephrase this?
Just because we exist via evolution doesn't mean that's the only possible way.
Now, note how there's a huge difference between saying this would be the best explanation versus saying this is the only possible way. Now, am I just being nitpicky? No. See, in logic and philosophy, when you're saying there's only one possible way, then the only thing you need to do to refute the argument is to show another possible way. That other possible way doesn't even have to be true, it just has to be possible if the person is arguing there is only one possibility. And possibilities are a dime a dozen. Now, this was literally one of her first mistakes in the careless area where she uses that word possibility so loosely and confidently. So, tally up another one for careless thinking. And the reason I'm spending so much time on this is because, one, it's a huge mistake here. It's a huge faulty thinking, and this is going to come up a lot later, unfortunately. So I wanted to lay a foundation for the problem with exchanging what I say with words like possibility or the only possible way or possibly X, Y, and Z. If I'm not saying that and using those words, which again in logic are technical words, then it becomes, as we just learned, a straw man.
Second, where is he going? I didn't know yet. I figured he was setting me up for a trap. I still didn't see it yet.
Or maybe you can just answer the questions honestly. Because if you're honest and open and you have arguments and evidence for review, then there's no need to avoid potential traps. Of course, this would have to assume that the person has thought through these things and have come to their position only after a careful analysis of the available evidence for the best arguments out there for and against one's view. But, I don't know. Maybe she hasn't. And if she hasn't, then maybe she shouldn't be so confident in her assertions when she hasn't thought through these things. Call me old-fashioned.
That might be the best explanation for the existence of humans, but that's not the best explanation for the existence of the universe.
Yes,
The
but
universe
I'm not
can
arguing...
exist without humans.
Right, yeah, and I'm not arguing on cosmology.
Okay.
He's not arguing on cosmology, but he needs to.
What? Okay, new category. What? Now remember earlier she said,
At this point, I had no idea where Eric's argument was headed.
and?
Where is he going? I didn't know yet.
So if you don't know where my argument is going, or you don't know where I'm headed, then how would you know that I need to argue from cosmology? And even then, need is also a technical word in philosophy. Regardless, my argument has nothing to do with cosmology. The evolutionary argument against naturalism is an epistemic argument, and just go watch the video, go watch the debate. You can find it on my channel, and you can see us discuss that back and forth. Or just rewind the video and watch the opening in my debate with Justin where I present the argument. Nevertheless, no, I don't need to argue from cosmology. This has nothing to do with my argument.
He's not arguing on cosmology, but he needs to. If his argument only works if humans exist, then did God exist before humans? Is God dependent on humans for its existence? I would argue that it does, but for entirely different reasons.
What? Huh.
And thank you for jumping in. I want to be clear, from the outset. That way, we don't talk past each other. So.
And again, the arrogant guest feels the need to give me permission to speak on my own show.
I think we'd all agree that if there's no God, our brains would not be designed to obtain truth. Yes?
Well, I don't think our brains were designed. So, yeah, okay. I would agree with you that I do think that is the case, but I don't know. I have not explored that idea far enough to know whether or not there are any other possibilities.
But as far as just as that statement stands, given there's no designer, our brains wouldn't be designed for anything, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So our brains aren't designed to obtain truth.
And so to say that natural selection is driving for any particular trait is incorrect. What it's doing is it's bringing about survival and flourishing, but not necessarily any particular trait that brings that about.
Right, which is exactly what my argument would say as well. Like that actually would only play into what I'm arguing. So
a major error I made here is in allowing Eric to conflate evolution with natural selection.
Nope, not conflating. In fact, just 2 minutes prior to the clip she played in our debate, I say this. Based on the evidence we have today, the best explanation would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection. So Darwinian evolution via natural selection, which implies they're not the same thing. I'm not conflating them. In fact, she plays that very clip in this video of her review. So all she had to do was not even watch the whole debate again, but just rewind her own video that she just commented on, where I say via natural selection. But yes, and amen. So it's only aiming for survival value, typically via adaptive behavior, just as you well articulated.
That is a mischaracterization of what I said.
Oh, so mischaracterizing someone's position or argument is a bad thing. Interesting.
I said that natural selection doesn't select for any particular trait or traits.
Correct. And I said, yes, and amen, because we actually agree here. And the agreement specifically is that we both agree that natural selection is not aiming for any particular types of traits. We agree that at best, its aim, if any, would be survival value. Hence, I'm only agreeing with what you said just a few seconds earlier.
But what is the result of natural selection is survival. What it's doing is it's bringing about survival and flourishing, but not necessarily any particular trait that brings that about.
Right, which is exactly what my argument would say as well. Like that actually would only play into what I'm arguing. And given that we agreed, I'm trying to move the argument forward by moving on to my next point. But here's her complaint.
I said nothing about adaptive behavior. We weren't talking about behavior at all.
True. And I was trying to do a few things here, and I admittedly worded it poorly. I take full responsibility for that. So allow me to clarify this before commenting on what she's saying. Sometimes I speak in parentheses. So you can see what I said in this way. It's only aiming for survival value, parentheses, typically via adaptive behavior, just as you well articulated. But allow me to make this clear by switching the words around and taking out the parentheses. It's only aiming for survival value, just as you well articulated, and this is typically done via adaptive behavior. And that could have sounded something like this. It's only aiming for survival value, just as you well articulated, typically via adaptive behavior. But even if we set this clarification aside, if she just lets the video play for 14 more seconds, I literally clarify what I'm saying. Again, though, the point being here is simply that it's not aiming for truth value. Its aim, if we can call it that, would be survival value, whatever causes the organism to adapt to survive. And note how I just defined survival value, whatever helps the organism adapt and survive. So it doesn't have to be behavior. I was just trying to move on to my next point because the evolutionary argument against naturalism focuses on behavior. Nevertheless, we can chalk it up to careless thinking, because again, she could have just let the video play for a few more seconds. I mean, she was there after all, she's in the video, and overly pedantic, because it had nothing to do with the argument, and there was no need to argue it, especially after I clarified. So, to reiterate something she said earlier in her video,
Had I brought this up, this would not have changed the argument, however.
so now that I've laid out the majority of my argument, I'm now going to get to the last part of the argument, which she'll immediately agree with, and then provide the conclusion. And this should sound familiar, similar to what you heard me present in my debate with Justin in the beginning of this video. So here's the next clip she plays, which again is the final point and then conclusion of the argument. All that being said, now you get to the fact that you can have false beliefs producing adaptive behavior and survival value. So my beliefs don't have to be true. Okay.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if false beliefs can produce survival value, and the brain is a byproduct of this natural selection, then what happens is, just like the microwave illustration, just as we have an undercutting defeater for any belief based on the read of the microwave, then if there's no God, we now have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces, including the belief there's no God. So if there is no God, and your brain tells you that there is no God, and given this undercutting defeater, you now have a belief that you shouldn't trust. And now here's the implication to the foundation that I laid in the beginning. Remember, either theism or atheism. If one is not true, the other is true. And thus, to even answer these questions, and then you wouldn't have knowledge because you would have all justification removed. To even have knowledge, atheism couldn't be true. And thus, if we do have knowledge, then atheism is false, and thus theism is true.
Yes.
She said yes, which means my argument passes even according to her. So, what's her response? Especially after 3 hours of thinking through this argument, according to her.
It took me about 3 hours after the conversation to see the fatal flaw in Eric's argument.
All right, so now we're going to get into some hopefully substantive responses to the argument. Finally, and what's my fatal flaw? What is her response, even though she just agreed and conceded the argument? Well, it's the same response that she gave in our discussion.
Yes, but it also works the other way around as well.
I didn't realize I had caught part of the defeater of the argument.
So she's essentially saying, well, yes, but you too. That's not a defeater for the argument. Okay, so what is a defeater? To simplify, a defeater is essentially a new belief that now becomes a reason to no longer hold the previous belief you once had. Now, recall she agreed with me. She said, yes, but. So she agrees with my argument. However, if she believes that there is a defeater to the argument, then she shouldn't believe it. But if she believes it, well, then she shouldn't believe that there's a defeater to the argument. So which is it? Do you agree and just claim that I have the same problem, in which case there's no defeater because you're agreeing with it? Or are you saying that it has a defeater and you agree with an argument that has been defeated? But maybe I'm missing something. Let's hear her explanation for why this is a defeater.
Because natural selection does not cause us to necessarily believe what is true, but what brings about best survival, if belief in God is valuable to our survival, we might believe in God even if there is no God.
Yes, but note how that only affirms my argument, though. It's not an objection to it.
No, I wasn't objecting to your argument. I'm just saying
Okay.
that the argument works both ways.
Okay, so a lot just happened there. First, she says the argument works both ways. Now, recall the conclusion of my argument. Keep in mind, I'm not rehashing my argument. In fact, you can just go back to the beginning of the video, and here's a timestamp for the relevant part of the argument. But the conclusion of my argument is that if there is no God, we now have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces, including the belief there is no God. Now, all she's done is essentially say, yes, but if there is no God, then our brain might also produce a belief that there is a God, and thus we shouldn't trust that either. So no, it doesn't work both ways. It's just another example of a belief that you cannot trust, because again, it is any belief your brain produces. Her giving me another example is not a defeater to the argument. It's a concession of the argument. But don't take my word for it. Let's play that back, and I want you to see this for yourself.
If belief in God is valuable to our survival, we might believe in God even if there is no God.
Yes, but note how that only affirms my argument, though. It's not an objection to it.
No, I wasn't objecting to your argument. I'm just saying
Okay.
that the argument works both ways.
So this brings me to the second point. Note how I just said that this wasn't an objection to the argument, and she agreed with me. So she admitted it's not an objection, and if it's not an objection, then how could it possibly be a defeater to the argument, as she mentioned earlier? So not only is it not a defeater, it's not even an objection to the argument. It's actually just agreeing with the argument.
That is where I fell apart.
I'm just going to leave that alone.
Because it is, in fact, a defeater of Eric's argument.
No. Okay, look, the tally marks are going to go up a lot. And she's actually going to repeat a lot of the same mistakes. And so when she does that, for the sake of time and for the sake of my sanity, I'm just going to reference timestamps in this video where I've already responded to some of the things she's going to say. So for this one, you don't really need a timestamp. Just rewind the video like 30 seconds. But okay, let's hear why she thinks this is actually a defeater. I'm genuinely curious. Hopefully we'll get something good.
If there is a God that designed our brains are capable of believing wrong things, then this God cannot exist.
I mean, I literally don't know what to do with this. Even if we took what she said and tried to put it into some kind of syllogism or structure of an argument, I don't know, let's give it a shot. She said if there is a God that designed our brains are capable of believing wrong things. Okay, now, I don't even see how that follows logically, but all right. Next, she says, then, maybe therefore, this God cannot exist. There's no that's not an argument.
Why? Eric gives it to you in a moment.
No, I don't. All she's about to do is just reiterate her remarks that even if there was no God, we still could have believed in God because it was of survival benefit, survival value. But I've already addressed that. So she's repeating herself, and you can just rewind, go back. Nevertheless, I let her continue because, after all,
This is my show. I don't need his permission to make comments on my show.
and then to try to save time in our dialogue, I just kind of set that point aside because it's already been addressed. And then I just reiterate that if she agrees with me, which you'll hear her say, then the conclusion still follows.
That is why the belief in God developed, is because at one time it was a survival benefit. And I think that is why we are moving away from religion, because it is losing it.
So going back to the argument then, if you've agreed so far then you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. Okay, so now what she's about to do is comment on why this is a defeater. So we're still on the same point about this allegedly being a defeater. So she's going to give a sort of a parody of my argument and try to show why this would equally apply to me. But keep my argument in mind. In fact, if you want to go back and get a refresher on it, see if what she's saying is actually parallel to what I've argued so far. And this is going to be a lot to untangle. It's a hot mess. So I'm just going to let it play through, and then we'll dissect it.
If there is a God that designed our brains in such a way that we are capable of believing false things, then we have an undercutting defeater for any thought that our brains produce, including the thought that there is a God that designed our brains. This is a self-defeating argument. It includes the thought that a God can exist. According to Eric's argument, we cannot know if a God exists, as we cannot know anything, as we could be wrong about any particular thing. By Eric's argument, no one can be sure of anything.
What?
Okay, well, let's try to take this one step at a time. And as before, let's try to put this into some type of a syllogistic structure of an argument, if we can. So here's the text of what she said. Premise 1, maybe? If there is a God that designed our brains in such a way that we are capable of believing false things, then we have an undercutting defeater for any thought that our brains produce, including the thought that there is a God that designed our brains. Now, one, this isn't an argument. And note how this is pretty much a reiteration of what you said earlier, except now we only have one premise instead of two. So we actually somehow lost a premise. And I think I picked up on what the problem is here. She's taking the conclusion of my argument and assuming that that is the entire argument in itself, or so it seems. So she's not provided an argument so far. She's giving a conclusion of an argument she has yet to give. So that's the first problem. Second, note how she is trying to parody my argument or give a parallel version of my argument against me. She is characterizing my argument as if I am trying to argue that if we are capable of believing false things, then we have an undercutting defeater for any thought that our brains produce. But is that what I argued? No, I didn't argue that just because we're capable of believing false things, therefore it's an undercutting defeater. I gave an entire case for this conclusion. And nowhere in there was I saying that just because we're capable of believing false things, therefore we have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces. Now, she's going to bring this up later, so for now, just suffice to say, this is not my argument. This is a straw man of my argument.
This is a self-defeating argument.
Well, even if it is, as I just explained, that's not my argument. That was a straw man of my argument. But let's hear why you think so. And as before, let's try to put this into some kind of a structure. We've already seen that it's not going to be a syllogism, and I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. So we'll put them in bullet points. As she explains, I'll put the text on the screen so you can see that I'm not mischaracterizing her. This is what she's saying. This is her argument for the point that she's about to make.
This is a self-defeating argument. It includes the thought that a God can exist. According to Eric's argument, we cannot know if a God exists, as we cannot know anything, as we could be wrong about any particular thing. By Eric's argument, no one can be sure of anything.
Let's untangle. We'll start with her huge mischaracterization of what I believe. So note how she claims that, according to Eric's argument, which is not my argument, that we cannot know anything. Now, why not? Well, because we could be wrong about any particular thing. Thus, she says, by Eric's argument, no one can be sure of anything. Now, what she's essentially doing is assuming that I hold to the belief that knowledge requires certainty, and thus if you cannot be certain of something, you cannot claim to know it. And what she's actually articulating is a view known as skepticism, which I wholeheartedly reject as an epistemology. What's epistemology? It's essentially the study of knowledge and beliefs, and how one comes to hold beliefs and then how one acquires knowledge. And because she's going to bring this up later, let's just say that this is a huge straw man of my epistemology. Moving on to the next problem. She claims that this is a self-defeating argument. Why? Well, because according to Eric's argument, allegedly, we cannot know if a God exists, and yet my argument includes the thought that a God exists. Now, the problems with this is multifaceted, multi-layered. The first being that actually no, my argument does not include the thought that a God can exist. Now, that may be a byproduct of the conclusion or implication of the conclusion of my argument, but it neither includes nor requires it. I even mentioned this in our discussion. So even if you said, well, theism is false, that only, again, adds credibility to my argument, because my argument assumes theism is false and then says, here's a conclusion. So it's a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument. So we can chop that up to a straw man and careless thinking. Additionally, even if we grant that her straw man mischaracterization of my position is true, this is still not a self-defeating argument. Now, what's a self-defeating argument or self-defeating statement? Well, as I previously mentioned, I have a whole chapter dedicated to understanding logical fallacies in my book. But essentially, a self-defeating argument or statement is a statement or argument that refutes itself by failing to meet its own standard. And this typically occurs when a person makes a claim, argument, or statement that proves itself false. So for example, if someone said there is no truth, you simply have to ask them, is that true? Because the very statement, there is no truth, is a statement that the person assumes is true, and yet if there is no truth, then by their own standard, the statement they just uttered cannot be true given that there is no truth. Hence, it is self-defeating. It proves itself false. So, is what she laid out, which again is a straw man of my position, is it self-defeating? No. This also has a few layers to it as to why this is incorrect. So we're like in an inception of logical fallacies. So on one level, note the difference between the thought that God exists and then saying we cannot know God exists. Her first bullet point refers to a belief that God exists, whereas the second refers to knowledge that God exists, or claiming to know God exists. So on this level, the problem here is that she is conflating belief and knowledge. Belief and knowledge are not the same thing. Now, on another level, there is nothing self-defeating about claiming to believe that God exists, and in the same breath, claiming to not know that God exists. What's even more is that even according to skepticism, this is not self-defeating. Even the skeptic can claim that they can believe something even while claiming to not know it. In fact, they may often will. The point for now is that this is not self-defeating, even in the way she's articulated. So, careless thinking in accusing me of a logical fallacy while committing quite a few of her own. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good foundation for the problematic way that she's thinking, especially what we just went through, because this is going to be a huge foundation of the rest of many of her logical fallacies and errors that she's going to make in her faulty thinking. And because I want to move this along, and there's going to be a lot of little things that she's going to say that are going to be tallies, and just for the sake of time, I'll just tally them up, and you can look at the category, and based on everything I've said, I'm sure you can piece together why I'm tallying it in this way. And on the errors that need more explanation, I'll go a little bit deeper.
Just because it's possible that I can believe something because it is of survival value to me doesn't mean that that is the reason that I believe it. I think our own ability to research the reasoning behind it is counter to that.
And what organ would you be using to do this?
Well, my brain, obviously.
Right, and the argument I gave just gave an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. Now recall my microwave illustration from earlier, where I said that you wake up from a nap and you look at the microwave and see that it says 12 o'clock, and on that basis form the belief that it is 12 o'clock. But then when you realize that the power has gone out, given that your belief is based on the reading of the microwave, you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief that is based on the reading of the microwave. So with this in mind, here's the problem with what she just said, which she actually explained in the dialogue itself. So with the microwave illustration, if I can go back that, and if I were to run to my bedroom and look at the alarm clock and say, well, the alarm clock says 12 o'clock as well, therefore I'm justified. The problem still remains that the power affects everything plugged into the wall. So I think what you're doing is you're appealing to other beliefs, but again, it's a belief your brain produces. And the undercutting aspect would be that it's not designed for truth, and it is aimed at best for survival value, not truth value. So you now have a reason to not trust. And I'm not saying even your beliefs are false. I'm not saying you can't have true beliefs. I'm saying that removes any justification for any belief your brain produces. And so here's what she now says in response to that, after thinking about it, according to her.
3 hours after the conversation.
So, what's our solution to defeating the evolutionary argument against naturalism in about 3 hours?
And using Eric's own example from earlier, if I see the electric clock giving me a time that I have reason to believe is false because of a power outage, I simply look at a source of information not dependent on a steady supply of power, like my phone or the computer, to get me the correct time.
Okay, so the problems with this. Now remember, given that she's claiming...
And using Eric's own example from earlier...
Let's look and see how my analogy relates to the argument, and then look at the solution she proposes. And let's see if it works. Now, recall my analogy. Both the alarm clock and the microwave are plugged into the power. But given that the power has gone out, you can now no longer trust any belief for the reading of the time if that belief is based on the reading of what the microwave is telling you. Hence, this becomes the undercutting defeater for the reliability of what the time reads for anything that is plugged into the power. Now, as she correctly noted, in order to know what time it is, you would have to use something like your phone or laptop because these things are not dependent or produced by the power. In the argument, you cannot trust any belief that your brain produces because you have this undercutting defeater. In other words, much like the power going out, you now have a reason to not trust any belief that your brain produces. Which means, in order for her solution to work analogously to the argument, that you're going to have to find some belief that is not going to be produced or rely upon your brain. But what kind of a belief would that be? What kind of non-brain belief could she have? In other words, if even this belief is going to be produced by your brain, well, then once again, given the undercutting defeater, you now have a reason to not trust it. So the problem with her solution is pretty straightforward when we compare this to the argument. So on one level, her solution cannot be analogous to the argument itself when it comes to the brain. And second, there is no way to get outside of your brain to form a belief. Unless, of course, you want to posit the existence of some kind of a soul. But we already got her answer to that in our discussion. Do you believe in something like a soul?
No.
And finally, given that her solution is still a belief that her brain produces, then we just go right back to the conclusion of the argument, which, remember, she's already agreed with, and right back to the problem that we started with in the first place. Hence, even after spending 3 hours on this new proposed solution, the question that I asked her earlier still applies. And what organ would you be using to do this?
Well, my brain, obviously.
Right, and the argument I gave just gave an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. Thus, her solution fails.
But when we look at multiple sources of information that all bring us to the same conclusion from the data, the conclusion is far more reliable.
Okay, so hopefully I don't have to spend a lot of time on this one, because it actually relates to pretty much everything we just said. She's just added a new twist to it. So going back to the illustration, what she just said would be analogous to this. But if we can look at multiple alarm clocks that all tell us it is 12 o'clock, well then this makes the original alarm clock, which mind you already had an undercutting defeater because it was plugged into power, but now that we have a lot more alarm clocks, that somehow gives us reason to believe that the conclusion is actually now reliable because we now have multiple sources of alarm clocks. But you can already see the problem here. All these alarm clocks will still have to be plugged into the power. And here's how this would be now analogous to the argument. She's essentially saying, well, sure, if my brain, given Darwinian evolution via natural selection and everything else that I talked about that gave it this undercutting defeater, you can go back and watch it. Even though my brain has this undercutting defeater, well, then all I have to do is go talk to other brains. But again, just like the alarm clock, you're still talking to brains that came about by the same process, and thus these brains would too have an undercutting defeater. So having multiple brains that all have the same undercutting defeater does not help this single brain that we've already established has the undercutting defeater to begin with. Once again, the solution doesn't work. So let's go back to her commentary. And ironically, she actually starts with the very clip that just undermined everything she just said. Nevertheless, here it is. And what organ would you be using to do this?
Well, my brain, obviously.
Right, and the argument I gave just gave an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces.
Here is where Eric's argument falls apart.
Well, I agree that an argument certainly fell apart. I just don't think it was mine.
He did not give an undercutting defeater for any belief my brain produces. He gave an undercutting defeater for the possibility that some beliefs might not be true.
Timestamp.
Eric is making the claim that because it is possible to believe false things, therefore you cannot be sure of anything you believe to be true, and thus you cannot have knowledge.
Remember I mentioned earlier that we're going to come back to skepticism because she's going to unpack this and then accuse me of it again a little bit later. Well, now it's a little bit later. Now, before getting into this, recall what she said earlier.
I'm familiar with enough of what was in Eric's book I read what was
It's
in
actually a
Eric's
pretty good
book.
argument.
As I mentioned earlier, I wholeheartedly reject skepticism. And again, while I don't necessarily expect her to have read the whole book, just in the 3rd chapter of the book, page 41, I talk about skepticism and help the reader understand the mindset and the method of the skeptic. And as you can see here, concerning the mindset, one of the defining characteristics of skepticism is the belief that knowledge requires certainty, and without certainty, knowledge is impossible. Now, this is precisely what she's accusing me of. In fact, she didn't even have to turn more than a few pages. If she had just looked at the table of contents, she would actually see that I have an entire chapter responding to skepticism. And in that chapter, page 146, I literally respond to the very things that she's accusing me of believing. Hence, I say, it becomes appropriate and indeed necessary to voice our disagreement with the skeptic's criterion of taking certainty as a requirement for knowledge. So this is a huge straw man and very, very careless thinking on her part, when she could have easily looked this up. Because not only have I debated skeptics and publicly many times given arguments against it and refutations to it, I've actually published on this and written on it in a book that she owns, in a Kindle version that, again, she could have just easily looked up. Huge straw man, and one that could have easily been avoided.
Eric has not given an undercutting defeater for any belief my brain produces.
Yes, I have.
Some of my beliefs cannot possibly be untrue.
Right. And I never said otherwise. Listen for yourself. I'm not saying even your beliefs are false. I'm not saying you can't have true beliefs. I'm saying that removes any justification for any belief your brain produces.
This cannot be a false belief just because it is possible to hold a false belief. But if Eric was right, if this were an undercutting defeater for any belief my brain produces, it would also be an undercutting defeater for any belief that any brain produced.
So note the straw man that she just mentioned a few seconds ago. She is claiming that I'm claiming, which again, I'm not, nor did I ever, that if it is possible to hold a false belief, that it must be a false belief. But let's pretend that she hadn't just mischaracterized and straw man my argument. She is correct when she says,
But if Eric was right, if this were an undercutting defeater for any belief my brain produces, it would also be an undercutting defeater for any belief that any brain produced.
correct. If my argument, in the way I've laid it out, not in the way you've strawmanned it, was true, then yes, this would be an undercutting defeater for any belief that any brain produced, which I mentioned multiple times in the debate, and I clarified this and even in this video, which is why this now becomes bizarre when she talked earlier about having multiple sources bringing us to the same data. You can see the timestamp here where I address this. And then later on, she brings this up again.
While it's possible for me to be mistaken about a particular thing, it's highly improbable for many or all people to be mistaken about the same observation.
But now we can just use her own words and let her respond and refute herself.
But if Eric was right, if this were an undercutting defeater for any belief my brain produces, it would also be an undercutting defeater for any belief that any brain produced.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
While this is supposed to be an argument against naturalism,
No, I don't know what this is, if by this you mean the argument that you've articulated, which was a straw man of mine. So I don't know what that argument is supposed to be about.
it isn't tied to naturalism.
Yes, it is. So this brings up another problem with her thinking, but now for different reasons than before. As I mentioned in this video and in my discussion with her, I'm giving a variation, or my version if you will, of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. And so now it seems like she's getting hung up on the title of the argument itself. Now, to reiterate, I was given a simplified version of the argument. Nevertheless, it's important to understand how Plantinga defines naturalism. And here it is in his own words.
I would say naturalism is the idea that there isn't any such person as God, or anything like God.
Now he goes on to give some further explanations of this, and of course in his books, he goes into much more depth. But the point for now is simply this. Naturalism would include the belief, as Plantinga has defined it, that there is no God. Hence, the foundation I laid in the beginning, where I said if there is no God, and given Darwinian evolution via natural selection, here are the implications. And in Plantinga's own words, here is the point of the argument.
If you accept naturalism and evolution, you can't think of your cognitive faculties as being reliable.
And I even explained this in our discussion. So I would even include our, what Plantinga would call our cognitive faculties. So let's just say our brain. Hence, the conclusion, if you've agreed so far then you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. Now look, I get that earlier she said,
Philosophy is not my field either.
and I'm not holding that against her. Nor did I hold it against her earlier that she didn't read my whole book, even though that would have given her a much better idea of what I actually believe. But what I do hold against her is the confidence that she exhibits in assuming to have conquered an argument that she has not yet taken the time to understand, even when there are resources out there to understand it. Granted, this may take a little more than 3 hours, but the point here would be, maybe don't be so confident in refuting an argument when it seems you still don't understand the argument itself. Moving on.
The claim is that because brains produce false beliefs, therefore one can't be sure of any thought that that brain produces. The argument has nothing to do with naturalism in the manner that Eric presented it.
Wait, say that again?
In the manner that Eric presented it.
What?
In the manner that Eric presented it. In the manner that Eric presented it.
What?
In the manner that...
What?
And what was the manner in which I presented it? Now, we've already seen that she has strawmanned my position many times, but here's what's odd now. Not only has she strawmanned my position, it's like she bait and switches it almost each time she brings it up. Or in other words, it's like she strawmanned my position, and then strawmanned the strawman, and then strawmanned the strawman, and then strawmanned that one, and... But don't take my word for it. So let's start with this. What was...
In the manner that Eric presented it.
Here's how I explain the undercutting defeater aspect of the argument. And the undercutting aspect would be that it's not designed for truth, and it is aimed at best for survival value, not truth value. So you now have a reason to not trust. And I'm not saying even your beliefs are false. I'm not saying you can't have true beliefs. I'm saying that removes any justification for any belief your brain produces. And if knowledge is a justified true belief, you now cannot even have knowledge if there is no God. Now, let's look at the many times she not only strawmanned it, but then begin to change it throughout her video.
Our brains are capable of believing wrong things. He gave an undercutting defeater for the possibility that some beliefs might not be true. Eric is making the claim that because it is possible to believe false things, therefore you cannot be sure of anything you believe to be true. This cannot be a false belief just because it is possible to hold a false belief. The claim is that because brains produce false beliefs, therefore one can't be sure of any thought that that brain produces.
So now imagine my shock when she says,
I was on the right track, I just didn't have time to develop that thought.
Moving on in her video. The problem still remains that the power affects everything plugged into the wall.
So you check a source that is not dependent on power plugged into the wall. It really is that simple. I just look at my phone.
Already addressed this. Timestamp here.
Neither of these are dependent on my believing them as a survival mechanism. Neither of these are dependent on natural selection.
Now, what's ironic is the very next clip she plays is a clip from our dialogue where I actually respond to the very thing that she's now saying in her commentary review video. And what's her response to that? Well, she spends about 5 minutes asking 10 plus questions, all irrelevant to the argument. And as my good friend Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity likes to remind us,
questions are not arguments.
Now that could be an entire category in itself, but that would make this video way longer. And I just don't want to do that. She tries her hand at philosophical theology, which she's already admitted.
Philosophy is not my field either.
And it's just a big mess. So rather than go through each of these questions, which again are completely irrelevant to the argument, I think it's summed up in this thing that she says here.
I think my very existence is a defeater for Eric's argument. If there is a God that designed our brains to believe only true things, then I would not be able to believe that such a God does not exist.
What?
Okay, hopefully, do I even have to respond to that? All you have to do is go back and either watch this video or the dialogue that we had, and you tell me, did I ever make the claim or argument that there is a God that designed our brains to only believe true things? I have no idea where she got that from. Complete straw man, out of thin air.
If there is a God that gave you a brain able to believe false things.
And she's once again just assuming that I hold to skepticism. Timestamp here, already responded to that. Straw man.
So either your argument is false, or Eric, you have no knowledge. Which is it?
Or false dichotomy, and you have just grossly misrepresented my argument, and you're responding and destroying the straw man. So either you understand my argument and you're misrepresenting me on purpose, or you still don't understand the argument. So Granny, which is it?
If your argument is true, you also can't have any knowledge even if there is a God.
I didn't realize I had caught that.
What?
And we don't have a mechanism that is
Well,
aiming
we don't
for
know that.
survival, not truth.
We don't
Well,
know
right.
that.
We don't know what.
We don't know that there is a God that gave us a reason to believe in truth.
But I think you're missing the point of the argument here. And in other words, I'm going to set that aside. Just feel free to bring it up later.
So his argument has completely fallen apart, and his response is, I'm going to set that aside, but feel free to bring it up later.
And I was the arrogant one on the show. And ironically, the very next thing she complains about is...
First, again with the arrogance of giving me permission to speak on my own show.
Moreover, no, my argument has not completely fallen apart. It's that you are once again showing that you don't understand the argument, and I'm trying to set non-relevant issues to the argument aside so we can just stick to the argument, and I'm trying to help you understand it. This is precisely why I say, but I think you're missing the point of the argument here.
Second, if his entire argument applies equally to his own claims as it does to mine,
She's just once again assuming that I hold to skepticism, which I don't, and we've already gone over this.
how can he just decide to ignore that?
I think you're missing the point of the argument here.
And if it is the case, wouldn't Christians then be the most intelligent people, as they are never fooled into believing false things?
What?
So why is Eric afraid to answer my question?
So, no, I'm not afraid to answer the question. I'm just trying to be nice and not outright say that the question is completely irrelevant and doesn't even apply to the argument to begin with.
And by that, you cannot have knowledge. So either your argument fails or your God doesn't exist.
So, 3 things. 1, she's just again on the assumption that I hold to skepticism, and we have already addressed that. See the timestamp. 2, even the option she just gave
So either your argument fails or your God doesn't exist.
don't make sense or logically follow. Now, this could get a little bit technical with those not familiar with syllogisms, but allow me to explain. Now, what she just said can be put into what's called a disjunctive syllogism, which would go as follows. Either A or B, not B, therefore A. Now let's take the 2 options she gave us and plug these into the variables. Again, it begins either A or B, so this would have to mean A, my argument fails, or B, God does not exist. Now, given these 2 options in this disjunctive syllogism, there are only one of 2 conclusions that we can come to. Let's look at the first one. Again, premise 1 would have to be either A or B. Premise 2, not B. And considering the options that she's provided, this would have to mean that God exists. Therefore, A, my argument fails. Now note how in this option, if my argument fails, well, it's only because God exists. So is she really trying to say that God exists and this is why my argument fails? Because if my argument fails, it can only be the case if God exists. But is this what she's trying to say? I don't think so. Well, let's look at the second option. As before, premise 1, either A or B. 2, not A, which, given her options, would mean that my argument is successful. Conclusion, therefore, B, God does not exist. But in this case, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So while the structure may be valid, it's not sound. In other words, how could it follow that God does not exist just because my argument is successful? So all this to say, once again, careless thinking, and yet so confident. And third, I actually do answer this question and show how it actually backfires on what she's trying to say. Now, to try and save some time here, because she actually reiterates this question a little more clearly later on, I'll play that clip, and then note the clip that she plays from our dialogue where I actually answer this, and this should sound familiar given that we just talked about disjunctive syllogisms.
There is still no reason to think a God exists.
This isn't a reason to believe in God. This is really just a reason that if I don't have knowledge, there probably is a God.
Now pause. As a side note here, she adds a caption correcting herself, but even in the correction that she makes, it is still a straw man of my position, so tally another mark for straw man by caption.
and that this God is okay. So you're saying that there's a positive reason to believe in a God as a result. Okay, go ahead. Why do you think that there is a positive reason to believe in a God?
So a few things here. As I explained, and maybe this person came in late, I'm not sure, but anyone familiar with the way, logic works in the sense of, especially when you have a disjunctive syllogism, this gets a little more technical, but essentially, if you have two options on the table, there either is a God or is not a God. Either A or, let's say, A or not A. If not A is false, then it's not A, therefore A is true. So, yes, if I can show one of these options is not true, then that is a positive reason to believe the other option.
Okay. But yeah. All right.
So anyway,
So you
Eric,
believe that there is reason to think that there is a God.
That argument was one of them, yeah.
Yeah.
And if that were enough, I even explained this earlier in our dialogue. In other words, it's an attack against atheism, because if atheism is false, theism is true. So even if you said, well, theism is false, that only, again, adds credibility to my argument, because my argument assumes theism is false and then says, here's a conclusion. So it's a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument.
Okay. Can we call this a draw?
So clearly not afraid to answer the question, and I did at least twice implicitly in our own dialogue. But as before, I think you're missing the point of the argument here.
That doesn't save his argument.
But I wasn't trying to save my argument. There was nothing to save it from. I was just trying to help you better understand the argument.
As he hasn't considered what his argument does to his position.
Nerdy Rodent asks a good question. I guess the question would then be, how does God know what is true? Because if no one designed God's brain, God doesn't even have a brain, how does God know what is true?
Right. The argument applies to things with brains, and as you said, God doesn't have a brain, so all that this means is that the argument doesn't apply. This would be no different than saying, bodies that don't work out die sooner. Well, God doesn't have a body, so therefore he must already be dead. No, it just means that it doesn't apply. So no, this doesn't affect the argument. It's just another example of careless thinking with confidence. Well, I would say God is omniscient necessarily.
So his response is presuppositionalism.
What?
No, you're asking me a question about my worldview and trying to do an internal critique, which I've already explained doesn't apply, so the internal critique doesn't apply, and I'm answering a question from my worldview based on what I believe. That is not presuppositionalism. You are asking me what I believe. You're welcome to push back on that, but you didn't, but that doesn't make it presuppositionalism. Okay, we have to move this along. So I'm just going to play some clips, and they're going to be all straw men, to show you that she just continues to straw man my position, mischaracterize it, and not understand the argument.
How can he have knowledge if he knows he can believe false things? Just because